Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Global History. I'm your host, Langella Sensei. So guys, last time we were here, we were talking mainly about North Africa and also Central Africa and the different types of societies that we see during this time. We mentioned really three major groups last time. Really, we looked at hunter-gatherer societies, looked at stateless societies that were really based around lineages, and we also focused on Muslim states. Remember, the two major groups for probably the more importantly, the major groups of the North Africa, the Almoravids and the Almohads, were the two most impactful of Africa of this time period. Remember, we did mention that hunter-gatherer societies still happen today, but they're not really that large of a population, and they're usually in places where most civilization would rather not live in because of dangerous environments that live there. Now, when we looked at stateless societies, it's actually pretty interesting to really analyze those different groups because it's based off of family traditions and really family culture and ties to different groups that were actually living using age sets groups that were basically groups of people that lived or were the same age of one another, and it's basically a very similar aspect to also Native American culture where they had to live through certain events and then they kind of have a ceremony and kind of move on to different stages of life. So that's kind of just a quick little summary of everything we did. I also showed you guys a map of the different sections to help you guys understand where we were talking about, but now let's transition into section 2, which is going to really focus on West African civilization. So let's have a look here. Let me just fix this for you guys. So West African civilizations, really, let me set the stage for you guys. We already mentioned the Almorads and the Almoravids were really building empires in North Africa, but we really started to see three new major powerful empires really flourish in Western Africa, and these different empires really arise of the area known as Sahel, which is really the Savannah region just south of the Sahara Desert. And really what sets this group apart compared to others is that they really flourish around the they're really trading empires. And we'll learn a lot about these three major empires, which are actually the Ghana, the Mali, and the Songhai. All right. So first, let's focus on the Ghana. All right. So in 200s, the Berbers began to use camels really to cross the Sahara, because you have to understand, guys, that other animals like oxen, donkeys, and horses, they will not be able to survive the harsh environments that the Sahara Desert really had posed. And it was actually the camels that were actually able to do this, and they actually used the camels to allow them to help them trade and ship goods over the Sahara Desert and through the Sahara Desert, because camels they actually needed less water to get past this point. All right, so when they use let's just continue from here. So really, when you look at the important part of Ghana, is they become extremely rich kingdom through trade, and what they do is they actually provide almost like a safeguard through any sort of groups that are trading through their territory, and that they kind of tax any sort of goods that are through their time. So by 700, they end up having more of a really a condensed and more dense control over this area, which allows them now to really be almost like the mediator of anyone that's trying to trade any goods through their territory. So they make a lot of money just on protecting people that are trying to trade, but then also try to trade themselves. So really what we really focus on that really shows how Ghana becomes as powerful as they do is really focusing on the gold and salt trade. So they did find different forests south of the Sahara Desert that were filled with different gold nuggets and gold where they can mine a lot of different gold from there. And then they actually had found salt as well that they had mined from the Sahara Desert and then carried to West Africa, which were then being traded to different parts of the world, right? And as I mentioned before, Ghana, the people of Ghana had made money in a lot of different ways. They had done it by firstly providing protection of those people trying to mine those different resources. They actually taxed the different trade there, and then they ensured really fairness of all different trade of different merchants of all different areas. So they had made a lot of money this way. So Ghana becomes really known as the land of gold, all right? By year 800, they become a massively wealthy empire. Ghana's king had basically controlled and commanded, really using his army, controlled this entire area of trade, and he actually would demand taxes and even tribute from the local chiefs of the area to really provide them peace, right? And it was very similar to an aspect of feudalistic society where he's almost acting as if he's the lord, right? And all these different chiefs of the area are his vassals, right? And by basically paying tribute to him, he will protect them. Now, what's a really important aspect of this is that the Ghana king, was the only one that can actually obtain or hold gold nuggets. Now, what is a gold nugget? If you are lucky enough to find a gold nugget somewhere on the ground somewhere or in the water or anything like that, you are one lucky individual, because gold nuggets are basically a condensed, more thicker piece of gold, and these are more rare to find, right? So the king is the only one that's capable of holding these gold nuggets. And the reason why this is important is because what the king did was he had regulated the amount of gold that was in the marketplace. And he was basically regulating the economy of the area. So since he was the only one that can hold that, he was making sure that the money supply of that entire area was under his domain, under his control, which was actually creating a solid stability of what wealth was, right? So based on the certain amount of gold that someone may have, the price of that is staying the same, right? Because it's not fluctuating, because as you find more gold, then obviously the prices of that gold are going to change because now there's more of it. By his command, by controlling the economy of this time, he has this massive army that he is not only amassed by his wealth, but just by his leadership over the many years. He becomes chief judge and also the religious leader of this time period. Now, in 1067, a Muslim geographer and scholar named Al-Bakir actually had described Ghana's royal court, and let me read it here for you guys. The king adorns himself wearing necklaces and bracelets. The court of appeal is held in domed pavilion, around which stand 10 horses with gold embroidered trappings. Behind the king stand 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the subordinate kings of his country, all wearing splendid garments and with their hair mixed with gold. So you can already hear just the fact that the amount of gold that he has in his possession, he's kind of just touting it. He's kind of just saying, I have all this gold in my possession and I can do whatever I want with it. It's trying to show the power of the Ghana kingdom, right? Now understand, we already know the influence that last time we were here, we talked about the northern influence of Islam on the different empires in North Africa. Now, the difference is, instead of it being through conquest, because remember, North Africa, Islam was kind of spread through conquest, it was completely different when it comes to the Kingdom of Ghana, right? South of Sahara, armies couldn't really pass through the Sahara Desert to get to the southern or western parts of Africa because it would be too difficult. Most of the people would die getting there. However, the difference is Islam was spread through trade, right? That's what's really important. The difference between the North African kingdoms that were influenced by Islam versus the southern or western groups were because they were trading with so many different people that they actually had gained a new religion, right? Remember, cultural diffusion can be spread through many different facets, whether it's through conquest, or trade, or just interaction with other people. That all plays to that same role, right? So even though Ghana's rulers had accepted Islam as a new building religion of the time period, they actually had still clung on to animistic beliefs. So animism, guys, is the belief that spirits are living in animals, plants, natural forces at play, and they play a major role in daily life. So you can kind of make this connection to a lot of the Native American tribes actually have this similar idealism of how basically spirits live in nature itself and that we have to respect nature. So this is very similar. So they kind of mold the ideas of Islam and animism together. So in the 1000s, Ghana rulers had converted to Islam and take Islamic advisors to help them develop a government structure that kind of mirrors the Islamic law, right? Now, this really, really grows amongst high class, right? Because and it really sparks them to want to learn more things. So they want to become more literate. They want to learn new Islamic books and different writings and different ideals. unfortunately for them, Ghana doesn't live long enough. The empire doesn't live long enough to really see how much they could have grown with this idealism, because the Almoravid conquest had eventually reached them, right? And that's really what's incredible about this, is that it took many years. Remember, we mentioned, I think it was around 200. It took so long to get to that point where they now have the capability of invading. So now let's take a look at the main idea here, guys. Why would the disruption of trade destroy Ghana's power, right? That's a really important question here. So if there is a war, right, if there is a battle that was causing a problem with the supply chain of Ghana, how would that hurt them, right? Just think about that. I mean, I want you guys to answer that on the worksheet. So now let's transition to the Empire of Mali, right? So in 1235, Ghana is then replaced by Mali, which is another massive kingdom that is based on the gold trade itself. Now, as Mali becomes wealthy, as the gold trade it starts to spark even more, and it starts to spread. Now we're going to learn more about Eastern African empires in the next section, but the gold trade ends up becoming so involved in many other parts of Africa, and once it connects to the eastern sections of Africa, that's where it really starts to spark completely in a whole another fashion that they did not even think was going to happen. So one of the really the biggest emperors of Mali was Sundiata, and he overthrew an unpopular ruler, and the reason why was because basically he was trying to cultivate control for several time, but then he ended up really around this time here, a lot of people were competing for power, and he ended up taking control over really kind of a long drawn out process. All right. So he becomes Mali's Mansa, right? So Mansa basically is another term for ruler. Okay. He conquers Ghana and a lot of the major cities of this time period, so of Kumbi and Walata, and under his time, there was a long era of prosperity and peace that had flowed with him. So it was almost similar to like a golden age. And the reason why you can kind of point to this is there was stability. All right, and what's interesting about him is that he actually had followed not really followed a lot of aspects, but he really had jump-started a lot of government styles or government rules that really we look at today and say, wow, I can't believe people during this time period had done that. And one of the things I mentioned is having really administrators in charge of different aspects of the government, right? That's very similar to what we look at the cabinet position. So he actually had administrators that were in charge of finances for the government, in charge of defense for the government, and even foreign affairs, involvement with other kingdoms, right? That's just crazy to think about, and only in 1235, right? That's just insane. But they were so organized, and they had really this stability about them that allowed them to grow pretty quickly, right? So he creates his new capital in Niani, and he promoted agriculture, and he really wanted to expand the gold and salt trade completely. And really, Niani becomes a kind of a centerpiece of Western Africa that really jumpstarts a lot of the progression in which he had really set in place. Where really the name Mali comes from is where the king lives. That's where the name of the empire really is named because of. All right. So Sundiata dies in 1255, and some rulers after him end up becoming Muslim, and probably one of the most famous and most powerful rulers that do follow him is Mansa Musa, right? And that's probably one of the names that you guys probably remember the most from learning from global history or just history in general. Mansa Musa was really powerful and really was influential in Africa, all right? So he actually only ruled for generally 20 years, but the time period between Sundiata and Mansa Musa, so that there's that gap period, there was a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of people fighting for power to try to gain control of that area that Sundiata had established, right? Remember, he had created a stable territory, and he had developed gold and salt trade. He had promoted agriculture, and now once he had passed, it was all up for grabs. There wasn't really a clear successor, and there's a lot of people fighting against one another. Now, Mansa Musa really stepped into the fray, and he was an extremely skilled military leader. He had a massive army. Let me tell you, for a time period where population was not clearly the same as it is today, and organization was a lot more difficult during this time period, he had a 100,000 man army that allowed him to really kind of break the barrier and really consolidate control of the Empire of Ghana, right? That had left, that really was left after, and even the Kingdom of Mali that Sundiata had left behind, right? So under him, he had expanded basically the empire, twice the size to what the Empire of Ghana was originally, right? When they first had created their empire, he had taken what Sundiata had made, and he had developed it even further, right? And what he did, very similar to what the other very powerful emperors have done before him, was to help him control this large area. He had set governors to really rule over the smaller parts of the area that he had controlled, right? Now, remember, as I said before, Mansa Musa was a Muslim, and he had actually went on the Hajj, and on his way back, he started to now really embrace the Islamic culture even more, and he had actually built mosques in places like Timbuktu and Gao, and really had put a lot of attention on his empire. So now more people were now traveling to his land to really learn about how his empire was really growing at a really fast pace, and they had created now more mosques than ever before, and even universities for education. Okay. So what I did for you guys, and I'll read this little excerpt for you guys here, but you guys will answer the questions on the worksheet on your own. So in 1324, Mansa Musa left Mali for the Hajj to Mecca. On the trip, he gave away enormous amounts of gold. Because of this, Europeans learned of Mali's wealth. In 1375, a Spanish mapmaker created an illustrated map showing Mansa Musa's kingdom in Western Africa. Drawn on the map is Mansa Musa holding a gold nugget, right? If you look down here, it shows you he's holding a gold nugget showing his wealth, right? So at the top of the map is Spain. At the bottom of Spain, the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic Ocean in the Strait of Gibraltar. South of Gibraltar is Africa. Filling most of the map is North Africa, with the Mediterranean extending east and Atlantic west of Gibraltar. So it really, when you look at this time period, Europe really didn't know much about Africa in general. They only knew about the parts they had interacted with. So when you look at North Africa and even West Africa, that was really the only parts they really looked into. Now, they definitely know more about, like, probably more of Eastern Africa, but when we learn about South Africa and even like the coastline of East Africa and lower East Africa, that will probably be more shown later on in section 3, because they show more trade develops during this time. But it just shows you how much respect Europeans had for Mansa Musa because of how much wealth his empire really had and how much power he had consolidated with his 100,000 man army. So probably one of the really things that really pushed, Mansa Musa and his kingdom over the top with popularity was in 1352. One of his successors, Mansa Musa's successors, had prepared a traveler named Ibn Battuta. Right? He was a famous explorer, and he mainly spent a lot of his time in North Africa. He had traveled for 27 years, guys, and he was traveling to all the different really Islamic states that were involved, that really had followed Islam, right? So after he had left the palace, the Empire of Mali's palace, and he had visited Timbuktu and other cities of Mali, he felt like this place was like phenomenal, right? He had no fear of crime. He had praised everyone. Because he was also a Muslim guy, so he was basically trying to compare his beliefs to what he was seeing in front of him, and he was praising the people and how well they knew the Quran. He also was, saying how, this place is beautiful, like it's massive and everything. The only thing that he kind of was a little like iffy on was just how strict the Islamic moral code was being followed by Mali's justice system, and here's what he has to say about it. So they are seldom unjust and have a greater adherence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan shows no mercy to anyone who is guilty of the least act of it. There is complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant is in or in it has anything to fear from robbers. So basically he's saying that now he is against the way that the Islamic moral code is being followed, but the justice system impressed him completely. Like the fact that they had no fear of crime really had left him like speechless, right? So he had left Mali in 1353, and then within 50 years, this kingdom had risen and fell within 50 years, which is really crazy to think about, because how powerful they had gotten, where basically Europe was basically acknowledging how strong and powerful they were, really crumbled. And really you can point to the reasoning behind it. It was similar to a lot of other kingdoms we've seen and we studied, was that the successors of this time didn't do a good job at governing this kingdom and the success, right? You have to understand that Mansa Musa was a great leader and he had the powerful 100-man army, but when he passes on and now let's just say that army chips away, less people are following it, they want to go do their own thing, that means the army's getting weaker, which means that he has less control over the massive area. And let's just say those governors want to do their own thing, that means he has less control over the mass area that they have. And this now causes more problems. Now, what really sets the kind of the turn for the Empire of Mali is that they start to run out of the different gold and salt fields in which they were using to develop their trade. Now, gold fields were more prevalent, more of a money maker to them, but these had actually shifted to Eastern Africa, which we're going to learn in section 3. So because they lost a lot of their gold fields, this had really caused the empire to really start to weaken pretty quickly. So now we look at the Empire of Songhai. So as they declined in the 1400s, people that were under control were actually trying to break away. So one of those groups that were under the control of the Mali Empire, the Songhai, were the people to the east. They had really tried to consolidate the control of the weakened empire and take it for themselves. So the reason why that this group really does set itself apart is they actually gain control of the trade routes that Mali had held so dear to themselves, right? So understand, once you control trade, that means you get the most wealth, which means that then you really have all the power here when you have the most money. So the Songhai do take control of the former territory of the Empire of Mali, but they do expand it even more. They use Gao as their capital of this new empire. Now, there's really two really good leaders of the Songhai Empire. The first is Sunni Ali, and we're going to go into him first. So he had built a massive empire through conquest, right? So his rule started in 1464 and lasted for generally around 30 years. Now, what set him apart that allowed him to take control was he had built really an elite fighting force. Now, it makes some people might laugh is that he had built a riverboat fleet of war canoes. And now that it might be a little like weird to look at, right? But a war canoe, just think of it this way. They're able to travel along different water routes, and they have several troops on a different canoe, and now they can shoot bow and arrows or even spears, and they also had an elite fighting force on horseback. So at around this time period, there's not really a lot of people that can really do this, but he was extremely strong as a military leader, which allowed him to really take an aggressive approach to people that were really trying to go against him. All right. So then we look at now the second leader, the Asakia Muhammad. So Sunni Ali had developed this empire, he had a strong fighting force, and when he had died, his son was now the new leader. Unfortunately for him, the son was then overthrown, and the reason why was because Sakia Muhammad was a devout Muslim, and he was not allowed, and him and his people were not allowed to really follow in Islam as much as they wanted to, right? So this allowed him and his people to really overthrow Sunni Ali's son, and now he became the new leader. So during his 37-year-old rule, he was an excellent leader, right? He had taken really the Songhai Empire and ran with it, right? The reason why he was so good was because you look at the few things he did. He set up a really efficient tax system, right? And he chose actually good leaders. That's really one of the first steps you have to do if you ever take over as a leader. That's like the first thing. You have to have really smart leaders that are smart administrators that are doing a good job in their roles. And then you have an effective way of really collecting money from the people that actually fund your government. Now, adding to the centralized, federal government that was once created by Sunni Ali, he had appointed people that were similar to other groups that we learned of already. He had really selected people to serve as ministers of different really positions of his government. So he even expanded it even more. We already talked about he had basically someone that deals with foreign affairs and all that stuff. He had people that were dealing with the treasury, right? He had people dealing with army and then the navy and agriculture, right? So it's just expanding the different roles in which administrators were taken care of. And under him, this government empire had thrived completely. Unfortunately, by 1591, his empire had fell to Moroccan invaders, and the reason why, it had nothing to do that their government was ineffective or anything like that. It was because the technology that his army had possessed was not on the same level as the Moroccan army was. Now, the Moroccan army had traded with China, who had developed gunpowder by this point, and new technologies were now being invented, as in cannons were now invented. So basically, the Songhai Empire was using people on horseback with swords and knives and spears, and then the Moroccan army was using cannons. Right, it's just there is no way they're gonna win against that, and despite all the wealth and all the the technology, the learning, it didn't matter because they did not have the modern weapons that they needed to really survive in this new atmosphere. Now, just think of it this way. The amount of years that these empires had lasted. Now, you look at the Empire of Ghana, the Empire of Mali, and the Empire of Songhai. These were 1,000-year period where basically these prosperous empires, one after the other, were in this area. And the army that takes it over is the group of the Moroccans beat them because of new technology that was being developed. So, with the empire really falling, we start to see now a shift into city-states grow into West Africa. Now, these city-states are really developed around groups that are speaking the similar language. So there's the Hausa city-states are the first group. So they're all basically the way it works is that these city-states are now competing against one another, and they all speak the similar language. So the Hausa language basically. It's just this Gruan group that all speaks a similar language. There's three powerful city-states that are competing against one another: the Kanu, Kastisna, and the Zazu, right? And these each had their own capitals. They basically had their own surrounding farming villages that they kind of ruled over, and they would trade on their own. Now, what's interesting is that when you hear about those things, they're similar to what we considered a feudalistic society, where basically they had their own rulers. They traded with their own groups. And they had kind of a surrounding, somewhat of a rural atmosphere around them, where those farms are now providing for not only that area, but they're trading as well. But the difference is they actually have almost like ministers that are checking them from having complete power. So it's not necessarily like a king, complete monarchy, or whatever, a chief that just rules over everything. They have basically their own ministers that rule over different aspects, and it's almost like provides a standard check and balance system for these different city-states. Now, one of the problems is that there's always there's continuous scheming against one another, and they're always fighting for gaining land. So it's very similar to the Warring States period that we've seen in China, that we've seen in Japan, that we've seen in Greece. They're always like basically trying to compete with one another to gain an advantage over somebody else. So when you look at why there hasn't been really an empire of the Hausa, right, is because they're always fighting for one another, and there's never really a consolidated leader that's going to take control of everything. So when you look at this question, what was the main reason that the Hausa did not develop an empire? I kind of said it, right? They're all battling against one another for control, right? There's never one consolidated leader. So now let's look at a different city-state emergence. They're just very similar to the Hausa. There's the Yoruba, and these people were similar, and they shared a common language, and they built their own city-states. So one is they lived in Benin, and one is in Nigeria, and these were small farming communities. Now over time, they did get larger and larger because of population increase, but they did join under stronger rulers that had consolidated different areas. Now, the difference is the Yoruba had basically seen their kings as being divine figures, right? The king of Ife, and it basically there's two major kingdoms, the Ife and the Oyo, which were the two largest of the Yoruba kingdoms. The Ife was probably the first largest, but then it was taken over by the Oyo, which had gotten bigger by 1600. Now, what's interesting, I just kind of add in here, the Yoruba had basically created a lot of these different types of kind of art projects, like using ivory, glass beads, and all these different things. And I kind of put one on the side here, and it's really a fabulous, like a more really like impressive art, art style that is really sold pretty highly in all different markets, whether it's in Asia or even Europe itself. So when we look at now probably the Yoruba groups that really start and create a kingdom, it's really out of the kingdom of Benin, right? Which is really based out of the kingdom on the Niger, right? So Oba Uware is really the one that we really point to as being the strongest leader of the kingdom of Benin, right? He really makes this kingdom into the strongest it's ever been, right? And he really sets the West African state to be really a staple and really to be probably the most known, right? And what he does is he creates a really strong army, and he creates a wall around his territory. Now, when you look at some of the accomplishments that they have, really you look at how much Europe really wanted to get involved with the different trade here. So in 1480s, the Portuguese sent trading ships to begin really trying to develop a trading relationship with the Benin, and they really trade a lot of different products. So they trade with pepper, leopard skins, ivory, and even enslaved people, right? Now, this begins a connection that happens between Africa and Europe that actually lasts for a very long time, because you have to understand they really take in, the slave trade really starts here, right? Because there are African empires that were taking in African slaves from inside, for more of the inner parts of Africa, and then selling them to Europeans and even people in Asia that actually have them be kind of forced labor, which really starts a chain reaction to really see how drastically how horrible the slave trade really starts out. And a lot of people really just think, well, it's only Europeans coming in and taking the slaves and then kind of just leaving. Not necessarily. A lot of it really starts from in Africa, where empires are really going into villages and taking people and then trading them off into Europe and other places to make a lot of money. So when we're going to discuss really in section 3 how these trade relationships, especially with East Africans, really transition into really showing how much Europe has a connection into Africa, and how they really have a staple or a footprint into something that happens many, many years down the line, where you guys are going to learn in Global 2. So we'll talk more about that in section 3. So what I do for you guys is I provide you guys a map, kind of the 3 different different groups or empires that we learned of. We learned of the Ghana, obviously the Mali, and the Songhai, and it shows you really how much they've grown. So this is the Ghana, this small little yellow portion here. The red portion here is the Mali, and then there's this bluish purple that's here, and this is the Songhai. So I want you guys to answer these questions at the bottom on the worksheet, and make sure that you take a look at the map along with it. And I want you guys to answer these questions. So first, how did the rulers of the Ghana grow rich? Number 2, who was Mali's first great leader? Number 3, what people broke away from Mali's empire and gained control of all important trade routes? Number 4, what is one way the Sundiata helped the Mali empire grow powerful and wealthy? And then lastly, how did Islam spread through Africa? And then I want you guys to answer these main ideas. Number 12, what accounted for Ghana's financial success? 13, what were 2 ways that Islam spread through Africa? And then lastly, number 14, what was the economy of the Hausa city-states like? Okay, guys, have a good one. I'll see you next time.